A mountain man bought the obese girl for $2 and was shocked when she took the sack off. The snow was falling hard in the Colorado high country. The auctioneer's voice echoed through the frozen street as rough-faced men jeered at the shivering figure with a burlap sack over her head. 2 coins hit the crate, just enough to claim her life. But when the sack came off, the mountain man didn't see what he expected. He saw eyes burning with pride and a secret she'd carried sewn into her very clothes. Now, with the mining company closing in, the cabin walls won't be enough to keep her safe. The land she never knew she owned holds the only water for miles, and powerful men will burn it all to the ground to take it from her. In a town where the law bends to the highest bidder, and the snow hides more than just tracks. What happens when a man who's sworn off the world is forced to fight for the one person he can't walk away from? Every time I see your comments, I'm reminded how stories connect us across distances, backgrounds, and hearts. If values like respect, courage, and compassion still guide you, then you're part of this story too. The biting wind whipped snow across the muddy street of Redfern as Jonas Hale guided the young woman toward the warmth of Miller's General Store. Her steps were determined, despite her trembling, and she kept her chin high even as curious onlookers whispered and pointed. The heavy coat he'd draped around her shoulders billowed in the gusts, but she clutched it close, her knuckles white with cold. Jonas's mind churned with questions. What kind of town allowed a woman to be sold like cattle? The memory of her fierce eyes when he'd lifted that crude sack made his chest tighten. There'd been fear there, yes, but something else too. A fire that spoke of strength. The bell above Miller's door jangled as they entered. Warm air wrapped around them, carrying the familiar scents of coffee, leather, and tobacco. Old Tom Miller looked up from his ledger, his wire-rimmed spectacles catching the lamplight. "Jonas Hale," the shopkeeper said, surprise clear in his voice. "Wasn't expecting you down from the high country for another—" He stopped short when he spotted the woman. "Well now." "Need some coffee, Tom," Jonas said quietly. 2 cups, and whatever's warm from Mrs. Miller's kitchen. The woman spoke up, her voice steady despite her shivering. "I can pay my own way, Mr. Hale." Jonas turned to her, noting how she stood straight-backed despite her obvious exhaustion. "No need. Least I can do after—" He trailed off, not wanting to mention the auction. "After buying me?" She met his gaze directly. "I suppose I should know the name of my owner." The last word carried a bitter edge. "Not your owner, miss, and you already heard my name, Jonas Hale." He gestured to a small table near the pot-bellied stove. "Please sit. Get warm." She hesitated, then moved to the chair, settling herself carefully. Jonas noticed how she positioned herself to keep both him and the door in view. Smart woman. Tom brought over 2 steaming cups and a plate of his wife's fresh biscuits. "Martha just pulled these from the oven," he said, then lingered, clearly curious. "Much obliged, Tom," Jonas said in a tone that suggested privacy would be appreciated. The shopkeeper took the hint and retreated behind his counter, though he kept glancing their way. The woman wrapped her hands around the cup, soaking in its warmth. After a long moment, she spoke. "My name is Margaret Byrne, Maggie to most." She paused. "I was a teacher in Denver before." "Before what brought you here?" Jonas kept his voice gentle. Maggie's fingers tightened on the cup. "Before my father's death left me with nothing but debts and men claiming pieces of our ranch." She took a careful sip of coffee. "I came to collect what was owed us by a former business partner. Instead, I found myself—" Her voice caught. "Treated worse than a stray dog," Jonas finished grimly. "Who was it put you up there?" "Does it matter? It seems to be how things work in your fine town." There was that fire again, burning behind her words. "Not my town," Jonas corrected. "I keep to myself up in the high country, come down only to trade furs and replenish supplies." He broke a biscuit in half, pushing part toward her. "Eat something. You're shaking." She accepted the offering, taking a small bite. "Why did you do it? Buy me?" Jonas considered his answer carefully. "Because it wasn't right. Simple as that." "Nothing's that simple, Mr. Hale." Maggie's eyes studied him. "What do you expect in return?" Expect? He shook his head. Nothing. You're free to go wherever you please, though I'd suggest waiting until this storm passes. Surprise flickered across her face, followed by suspicion. Just like that? You spend $2 and want nothing in return? $2 to stop something wrong from happening seems like a bargain. He sipped his coffee. Though you mentioned you can cook, sew, and shoot. Interesting combination for a school teacher. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. My father believed in practical education, said a woman should know how to survive on her own. Wise man. Yes, he was. Sadness crept into her voice. He taught me everything, except how to hold on to our land when every man in Denver seemed to have a piece of paper claiming it was theirs. Jonas leaned back in his chair, studying her. Despite her size, which some might call heavy, there was a natural grace to her movements. Her dark hair, escaping its pins after the day's ordeal, curled softly around a face that spoke of both gentility and determination. She was, he realized, quite beautiful, though he pushed that thought aside. These men in Denver, he said. They have legal claims? They have papers with my father's signature, or what they say is his signature. Her jaw tightened. He was too sick near the end to read properly. They took advantage. And the man here in Redfern? Samuel Blackwood. He was father's partner in a mining venture years ago. He owes us money that could help me fight the others. She stared into her cup. But when I tried to see him, his men... She swallowed hard. Jonas felt anger stirring. He knew of Blackwood, a man who'd grown rich on others' misfortunes. So they decided to sell you instead of letting you collect a debt. They said it would cover my travel expenses to Redfern. Maggie's laugh held no humor. I should have known better than to come alone. You're brave, Jonas said simply. Foolish, maybe, but brave. She looked up sharply, but something in his expression made her soften. Perhaps both. She finished her biscuit. What happens now, Mr. Hale? That depends on you. Storm's getting worse, you can hear it howling out there. I've got a room at the boarding house. Mrs. Chen keeps a clean place, runs it proper. I can arrange a room for you there. With what money? I have nothing left. I've got credit with Mrs. Chen. She takes my furs sometimes, makes them into trim for fancy folks' coats. He stood, gathering their empty cups. Let me see to it. Then tomorrow, when the weather clears, you can decide your next move. Maggie stood as well, drawing herself up to her full height. I won't be adding to my debt to you, Mr. Hale. Not a debt, consider it, he searched for the right words. Consider it one person helping another, the way things ought to be. Something shifted in her expression, a softening around her eyes, though her voice remained cautious. You're either the most decent man I've met in months, or the most clever at hiding your true intentions. Ain't clever enough to hide much of anything, Jonas said. Ask anyone in town, they'll tell you Jonas Hale's as simple as they come. What you see is what you get. And what I see, Maggie said slowly, is a man who paid $2 to help a stranger, expects nothing in return, and offers more help besides. She shook her head. It seems almost too good to be true. Maybe. Jonas shrugged. Or maybe sometimes things really are as simple as seeing something wrong and trying to make it right. The storm rattled the windows, emphasizing the warmth and safety of their shelter. Maggie pulled his coat tighter around her shoulders, and Jonas noticed how the gesture made her seem smaller, more vulnerable, though that fire still burned in her eyes. Very well, Mr. Hale, she said finally. I accept your help. For tonight. Tomorrow we can discuss how I might repay your kindness. Nothing to repay, he insisted, but she held up a hand. My father also taught me that pride is sometimes worth more than gold. Let me keep mine by finding a way to return your generosity. Jonas recognized the steel in her tone and nodded. As you wish, Miss Byrne. He turned to Tom, who was still pretending not to listen. Tom, would you send your boy to tell Mrs. Chen we're coming? And maybe have him fetch the doctor to look in on Miss Byrne. No, doctor, Maggie said firmly. I'm cold and tired, nothing more. As you wish, Jonas repeated, though he made a mental note to have Mrs. Chen keep an eye on her through the night. Shall we go? It's not far, but we'll want to move quick through this weather. As they prepared to step back into the storm, Maggie paused. Mr. Hale? Yes? Thank you. Not just for... She gestured vaguely, encompassing everything that had happened. But for treating me like a person, like someone worth helping. Jonas felt something stir in his chest, something he thought had died with his wife years ago. He pushed it aside and opened the door, letting in a swirl of snow. Everyone's worth helping, Miss Byrne. Sometimes they just need reminding of that fact. Together they stepped out into the swirling white, two figures moving through the gathering dusk of a Colorado winter, each carrying their own burdens, but somehow walking lighter for having shared them, if only for a moment. The wind howled down Main Street as Jonas led Maggie toward the livery stable where he'd left his mule. Snow was falling harder now, thick flakes catching in Maggie's dark hair and settling on Jonas's broad shoulders. The street had emptied as townsfolk hurried inside, leaving only their footprints in the gathering white. My cabin's about 3 miles up, Jonas explained, his breath frosting in the air. It ain't much, but it's warm and dry. He paused at the stable door. That is, if you're certain you want to come. Mrs. Chen's boarding house is still an option. Maggie pulled his coat tighter around herself. I'd rather not stay in town, Mr. Hale. Too many eyes, too many whispers. Jonas nodded, understanding her desire for privacy after the day's humiliation. He pushed open the heavy door, leading her into the warmth of the stable. The familiar sense of hay and leather wrapped around them as they walked past the stalls to where his mule waited. This here's Bessie, he said, patting the mule's neck. She ain't pretty, but she's sure-footed in the snow. Maggie approached the animal carefully. Hello, Bessie. She reached out, letting the mule sniff her hand. Bessie's ears pricked forward with interest. She likes you, Jonas observed, surprised. Bessie usually took a dislike to strangers. He busied himself checking the saddle straps, making sure everything was secure. Need help mounting up? I can manage, Maggie said. But when she tried to put her foot in the stirrup, her skirts hampered her movement. After a moment's struggle, she sighed. Perhaps I could use a hand after all. Jonas positioned himself beside her, making a stirrup with his linked hands. On 3. 1, 2. He boosted her up, noticing how she moved with unexpected grace despite her size. Once she was settled in the saddle, he gathered Bessie's reins and led them out into the gathering storm. The wind had picked up, driving the snow sideways. Jonas walked beside the mule, one hand on the reins, the other shielding his eyes. The town fell away behind them as they followed the winding trail into the foothills. The silence between them was broken only by the crunch of snow under their feet and Bessie's occasional snort. After about half a mile, Jonas glanced up at his passenger. Mind telling me how you ended up on that auction block? Maggie was quiet so long he thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was tight with controlled emotion. My uncle brought me west 6 months ago, said he needed help with his boarding house in Denver. She laughed bitterly. What he really needed was unpaid labor. When I demanded wages, he turned me out. That's when you came to Redfern? Not directly. She shifted in the saddle, adjusting her skirts. I tried finding work in Denver first, but the mining company there, they had some claim to my father's land. When I went to dispute it, She trailed off, then continued more firmly. Let's just say they made it clear a woman alone had no business questioning their legal rights. Jonas heard the pain beneath her measured words but didn't press. They walked on in silence as the snow deepened around them. The wind picked up, whipping Jonas's coat around Maggie's shoulders. How much further? She asked after what seemed like hours. Not far now. See that ridge? He pointed through the swirling snow. Cabin's just beyond it. It was full dark by the time they reached the small clearing where Jonas's cabin stood. The simple log structure was barely visible through the storm, but warm light leaked through its single window. Jonas had banked the fire before leaving that morning, and he said a silent prayer of thanks that it had held. He helped Maggie down from Bessie, then led the mule to the lean-to shelter beside the cabin. After making sure the animal was settled with hay and water, he stamped the snow from his boots and ushered Maggie inside. The cabin was small but neat, with a stone fireplace along one wall and a narrow bunk built into another. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs stood near the window, and shelves lined with provisions took up most of the remaining wall space. Jonas quickly built up the fire while Maggie stood warming her hands. "Coffee?" he offered, moving to the iron stove in the corner. "Please." She looked around the cabin with interest. "You keep a tidy home, Mr. Hale." "Jonas," he corrected, measuring coffee into the pot. "And there ain't much to keep tidy when you live alone." Maggie unwrapped herself from his coat, hanging it carefully by the door. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward his supplies. At his nod, she began examining the shelves. "You have flour, salt, lard. I could make biscuits to go with the coffee." Jonas blinked in surprise. "Didn't even know I had those things." "A bachelor's cupboard," she said with a small smile, already gathering what she needed. "Men tend to buy supplies and forget about them." She worked efficiently, mixing ingredients in a bowl she found hanging from a peg. Jonas watched, amazed at how she transformed his forgotten supplies into something promising. Soon, the cabin filled with the smell of baking bread. When the biscuits were done, they sat at the table with their coffee and warm food between them. Jonas couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten something that wasn't cooked over an open fire or straight from a tin. "These are good," he said, breaking open a steaming biscuit. "Real good." "It's the least I can do." Maggie wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "But I want to be clear, Mr. Hale. Jonas, I won't be staying long, just until I can find honest work somewhere." Jonas nodded, though he glanced meaningfully at the window where snow still fell heavily. "Reckon this storm might have other ideas about that. Could last days up here in the high country?" "Then I'll help earn my keep until it passes," she said firmly. "I meant what I said earlier. I can cook, sew, shoot if needed." "No need to prove anything," Jonas said. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need." They finished the meal in comfortable silence. Afterward, Maggie insisted on helping clean up, washing their few dishes in water Jonas brought in from his rain barrel. The domestic routine felt strange to Jonas, who'd grown used to his solitary ways. When everything was put away, Jonas pulled fresh blankets from his trunk and made up the bunk. "You take the bed," he said, laying his bedroll on the floor near the fire. "I'm used to sleeping rough." Maggie looked like she wanted to protest but was too tired to argue. She sat on the edge of the bunk, unlacing her boots. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For everything." Jonas just nodded, banking the fire for the night. By the time he'd finished, Maggie was already asleep, her breathing deep and even. He studied her face in the firelight, noticing how the worried lines had smoothed away in sleep. She looked younger, more vulnerable, and something protective stirred in his chest. Settling onto his bedroll, Jonas listened to the wind howling outside and his unexpected guest's soft breathing. It had been a long time since he'd shared his space with another person. He'd grown comfortable with solitude, or so he'd thought. But now, with Maggie's presence filling the cabin with unfamiliar warmth, he wasn't so sure. The fire crackled softly, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin, there was peace. Jonas pulled his blanket up to his chin and closed his eyes, wondering what tomorrow would bring. Dawn crept over the mountain peaks, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pearl and gold. Inside Jonas's cabin, the temperature had dropped enough that their breath formed tiny clouds in the air. The storm that had blown in the previous night showed no signs of letting up. If anything, it had intensified. Jonas stirred from his bedroll near the dying embers of the fire, his joints stiff from the cold floor. He glanced toward the bunk where Maggie still slept soundly, wrapped in several layers of blankets. Moving quietly, he added wood to the fire and pulled on his heavy coat. Outside, the snow had drifted nearly to the windowsill. Jonas trudged through knee-deep powder to the woodpile, now mostly buried under white. He'd need to dig it out and bring in enough wood to last them through what looked to be a long storm. The familiar rhythm of splitting wood warmed him despite the biting wind. Each stroke of the axe sent chips of wood flying, the sharp crack echoing off the surrounding trees. He'd worked up a good sweat by the time he heard movement inside the cabin. Through the frosted window he could see Maggie moving about, her shape blurred by the ice crystals on the glass. When he carried in an armload of split wood, he found her at the cook stove, stirring a pot of cornmeal mush. "Figured you might be hungry after all that chopping," she said, not turning around. "Found some cornmeal in your stores." Jonas stamped the snow from his boots. "Much obliged. Been a while since I had a hot breakfast that wasn't salt pork and coffee." "Well, it's nothing fancy." Maggie spooned the steaming mush into 2 tin bowls, "but it'll stick to your ribs." They sat at the small table, the wind whistling through the cabin's chinks despite Jonas's careful chinking. Maggie had found a jar of molasses, and the sweet syrup made the simple meal taste like something special. The peaceful morning shattered at the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Jonas rose quickly, moving to the window. Through the swirling snow, he made out a familiar figure on horseback. Sheriff Tom Brackett, his long, oilskinned slicker crusted with ice. "Stay inside," Jonas told Maggie, who had half risen from her chair. He grabbed his coat and stepped out to meet the lawman. The sheriff's horse stamped restlessly in the deep snow, steam rising from its flanks. Brackett's weathered face was grim beneath his snow-dusted hat brim. "Morning, Jonas," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "Quite a storm we're having." "Reckoned so." Jonas crossed his arms, waiting. The sheriff hadn't ridden up here in this weather for small talk. Brackett shifted in his saddle. "Had a visit last night from a fellow claiming to be Miss Garrison's uncle. Says you've stolen his property." "Property?" Jonas's voice went hard as iron. "She ain't property." "According to him, she signed a contract to cook for his mining camp. He's demanding she be returned." The sheriff paused, ice crackling on his slicker as he leaned forward. "The mining syndicate's backing his claim, Jonas." "That so?" Jonas's jaw tightened. "And what does the law say about selling people at auction?" "You know as well as I do that wasn't legal." Brackett sighed, his breath frosting in the air. "But contracts are binding out here. If he's got papers—" The cabin door opened and Maggie stepped out, wrapped in Jonas's spare coat. Her face was pale but determined. "I never signed any contract, Sheriff. My uncle promised me honest work and wages. When I refused to—" She swallowed hard. "When I refused his other terms, he abandoned me here." The sheriff's expression softened slightly. "What other terms, Miss Garrison?" "He said I'd be paid in other ways." Her voice was steady, but Jonas saw her hands trembling. "That the miners would be generous with their attention." A muscle jumped in Jonas's jaw. He'd suspected something of the sort, but hearing it confirmed made his blood boil. Brackett was quiet for a long moment, snow gathering on his shoulders. "That's a serious accusation, miss, but without proof." "I ain't handing her over," Jonas cut in, "contract or no contract." "The syndicate won't let this go," the sheriff warned. "They back your uncle's operation, miss. They've got lawyers in Denver who can make things mighty uncomfortable for folks who cross them." "Let them try." Jonas's voice was quiet but carried clearly through the howling wind. "She stays here of her own free will, Sheriff. Any man who says different will answer to me." Brackett studied them both, his expression unreadable. Finally, he gathered his reins. "I'll tell them what you said, but watch your back, Jonas. These mining outfits don't take kindly to being defied." He touched his hat brim. "Miss Garrison." They watched him ride away, his figure quickly swallowed by the swirling snow. Only when the hoofbeats had faded did Jonas notice how close Maggie was standing, her shoulder nearly touching his arm. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. "Stand up to him for me." Jonas turned to face her. "Your uncle, he really meant to—" "Yes." She wrapped her arms around herself, though whether from cold or memory, Jonas couldn't tell. "He told me the miners were lonely men, far from home. Said a woman of my size should be grateful for whatever attention she could get." Anger surged through Jonas, hot enough to melt the snow around them. No wonder you looked ready to bite when I bought you at that auction. I thought you were just like the others." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "I've never been so glad to be wrong." They went back inside, where the remains of breakfast had gone cold. Jonas added wood to the fire while Maggie cleared the table. The familiar tasks helped settle his anger, though it still smoldered beneath the surface. "We should check your gear while we're stuck inside," Maggie said after a while. "I noticed some of your trap lines needed mending." Jonas raised an eyebrow. "You know about trap lines?" "My father taught me before he died." She was already gathering his equipment from where it hung on the wall. Said a woman should know how to survive on her own. They spent the afternoon working together, the storm raging outside. Maggie's fingers were quick and sure with the repairs, her stitches neat and strong. Jonas found himself watching her work, noticing how her face settled into calm concentration, so different from the fear and anger he'd seen yesterday. But under their quiet industry lay a current of tension. The sheriff's warning echoed in Jonas's mind. The mining syndicate was powerful in these parts, with fingers in every pie from Denver to the territory line. They could make life very difficult for a solitary trapper who defied them. Looking at Maggie, though, at her quiet dignity as she worked, her determination to make her own way, Jonas knew he'd made the right choice. Whatever trouble came, he'd face it. She deserved the chance to choose her own path, not be sold into something worse than slavery. The wind howled around the cabin's corners, rattling the shutters. Inside, the fire crackled steadily, and the repetitive motion of their work created an island of peace. But both of them knew it was only temporary. Sooner or later the storm would break, and with clear weather would come the trouble the sheriff had promised. Jonas watched Maggie test the strength of a mended trapline, her face intent on her work. He'd lived alone for years, keeping to himself, avoiding other people's problems. Now, in the space of a day, he'd taken on not just a house guest but a fight with the most powerful outfit in the territory. Strangely, he found he didn't regret it one bit. The third morning brought a welcome change. Jonas woke to find the savage howl of wind had softened to a gentle whisper. Through the frost-edged window, fat snowflakes drifted down in a peaceful curtain, adding to the deep blanket that transformed the mountain landscape into something from a dream. Maggie already had coffee brewing when he emerged from his bedroll on the floor. The rich aroma filled the small cabin, mixing with wood smoke from the freshly stoked fire. "Storm's letting up," she said, handing him a steaming cup. "Might be a good day to check those trap lines of yours." Jonas took a careful sip, studying her over the rim. "Been thinking about that myself, though the snow's still deep. Deep enough to need help, I'd say." Maggie's eyes met his, challenging. "I could come along, make myself useful." "It's rough country," Jonas warned, though he was already considering it. Extra hands would make the work go faster. Long walk through deep snow. "I may be heavy, Mr. Hale, but I'm strong." Her chin lifted. "And I need fresh air as much as anyone. Been cooped up in here 3 days now." Jonas couldn't argue with that. The cabin, though snug, was cramped for 2 people, and she had proven capable with his gear during yesterday's mending. "All right," he agreed, "but you'll need warmer clothes than that dress." From his chest of winter gear, Jonas produced wool trousers, thick socks, and a heavy coat that had belonged to his wife Sarah. They were too big for Maggie, but better than skirts in deep snow. She disappeared behind the privacy screen he'd rigged from a blanket, emerging minutes later looking like a proper mountain woman, if somewhat swallowed by the oversized clothes. After a breakfast of cornbread and coffee, they set out. Jonas's mule, Button, carried their supplies, rope, tools, and bags, for any pelts they might collect. The morning air was crisp and clean, the only sound the soft crunch of their boots in the fresh snow. Maggie proved steady on her feet, picking her way carefully but keeping pace. Jonas found himself impressed by her determination. Many townfolk would have complained about such conditions, but she seemed to take it in stride. "My pa used to say there's no such thing as bad weather," she said, catching his appraising look. "Just folk who don't know how to dress for it." They reached the first trap line after an hour's walk. Jonas showed her how to check for signs of animal activity in the snow, explaining his system of marking trees to remember locations. Maggie listened intently, asking smart questions that showed she was truly interested, not just being polite. The second trap held their first prize, a red fox, its russet fur frosted with snow. Jonas demonstrated how to carefully remove and reset the trap while Maggie watched. At the third location, they found another fox, this one silver gray. Beautiful, Maggie breathed, running a gentle hand over the frozen fur. Seems almost a shame. Nature provides, Jonas said quietly. Long as we take only what we need, show respect for the gift. They worked their way along the line, finding one snare damaged by what looked like a deer stepping through it. Jonas showed Maggie how to repair it, her quick fingers soon matching his skill at the delicate work. You're good at this, he observed as she tested the tension on the wire. Had lots of practice mending things. She smiled slightly. When you grow up poor, you learn to make do. The sun was past its peak when they turned back toward the cabin, their bag heavier by 2 fine pelts. Maggie's cheeks were pink with cold and exertion, but she hadn't complained once about the walking or the work. Back at the cabin, while Jonas tended to button and stored their gear, Maggie disappeared inside. By the time he'd finished, savory smells were drifting from the chimney. He entered to find her stirring a pot over the fire. Found some of that venison you had dried, she explained. Thought a proper stew might taste good after being out in the cold. Jonas hung his coat by the door, inhaling deeply. Smells like my mother's cooking. High praise, Maggie smiled, adding a pinch of dried herbs from her pocket, though I doubt it's quite that good. They settled into comfortable silence as she cooked and he cleaned his tools. The stew bubbled gently, filling the cabin with warmth and good smells. Outside, snow continued to fall in its peaceful curtain, while daylight slowly faded. Over bowls of rich stew and the last of the cornbread, they began sharing pieces of their lives. Jonas found himself talking about his years as a homesteader, the small herd of cattle he'd built up, the cabin he'd made bigger each year, planning for children that never came. Sarah, my wife, she loved it here, he said softly. Even when times were hard, said the mountains made her feel close to God. Maggie's eyes were gentle. What happened to her? Fever took her. Jonas stared into his bowl. 3 years ago come spring. Lost the herd that same year to bad winter and debt. Seemed easier to let it all go, start fresh up here. Maggie nodded, understanding in her face. My pa died when I was 12. Accident with a horse. Mama had passed when I was little, so my uncle took me in. Her mouth twisted slightly, though took in might be too kind a way to put it. He worked you hard? Jonas asked carefully. Like a hired hand, except hired hands got paid. She pushed her empty bowl away. Still, I learned things. How to run a farm, keep books, handle stock. Might have been all right if he hadn't gotten the gold fever and dragged me out here. Jonas watched her face in the lamplight, seeing the strength there beneath the hurt. No wonder she'd fought so hard against being sold like property. She'd already spent too many years being used by others. After supper, while Jonas banked the fire for the night, Maggie sat mending a tear in her skirt from their journey to town. Her expression grew curious as she examined the hem. That's odd, she murmured, fingers exploring the fabric. What's odd? Jonas asked, settling in his chair with his pipe. There's a pocket sewn into the hem. I didn't know it was there. She worked carefully with her needle, exposing a small space between layers of fabric. Her fingers extracted something, a folded paper, yellow with age. Jonas watched as she turned it over in her hands, clearly curious but not opening it yet. She tucked it carefully into her borrowed coat pocket. Important? He asked mildly. Don't know. She resumed her mending. I'll look at it after I finish this. Don't want to lose my light. Jonas nodded and said nothing more, though questions stirred in his mind. He'd learned that some mysteries revealed themselves in their own time. The evening settled into peaceful quiet, broken only by the soft click of Maggie's needle and the whisper of wind in the pines outside. The lamp cast warm shadows on the log walls, and the banked fire glowed steady and red. Jonas found himself watching Maggie's hands as she worked, sure and capable with the needle. She hummed softly. He recognized the tune as Amazing Grace, and seemed more at ease than he'd yet seen her. Outside, snow continued to fall in its gentle curtain, adding to the hushed feeling of the evening. The mountains kept their own counsel, patient as always, while secrets waited to be revealed in their own time. Morning dawned clear and cold, the storm finally spent. Sunlight glinted off fresh snow that blanketed everything in pristine white. The change in weather brought welcome relief after days of being mostly confined indoors. Jonas pulled on his heavy coat and headed outside to replenish their dwindling woodpile. The sharp crack of his axe rang through the crisp air as he split logs, his breath forming clouds in the morning chill. Inside the cabin, Maggie had just finished washing their breakfast dishes when she remembered the paper she'd found in her skirt the evening before. She dried her hands on her apron and retrieved the folded document from her borrowed coat pocket. The paper was yellowed with age, its creases worn soft from being folded for so long. Her fingers trembled slightly as she unfolded it carefully, smoothing it flat on the rough-hewn table. Her eyes widened as she read the formal script. It was a land deed, properly signed and notarized, dated 8 years ago. But what made her heart skip was the name written clearly across the top, her father's name, James Garrison. The document granted clear title to 40 acres of land along something called Cold Spring Branch. "Pa," she whispered, touching the familiar signature. She'd watched him sign documents just like this one at their farm in Missouri, his careful penmanship a point of pride. But why would he have bought land out here? And why sew the deed into her skirt without telling her? The steady rhythm of Jonas's axe continued outside as she studied every word. The boundaries were clearly marked, from the spring's source down to where it joined Thunder Creek, 40 acres of good bottom land with water rights. It was all legal, stamped with an official seal and everything. Unable to contain herself any longer, Maggie hurried to the door. "Jonas," she called out, "could you come look at something?" He paused mid-swing, turning toward her voice. Seeing her excitement, he stuck the axe in the chopping block and strode over, stomping snow from his boots before stepping inside. "What is it?" he asked, unwinding his muffler. Maggie's hands shook as she held out the paper. "It's a deed. My father's name is on it. For land right here in Colorado Territory." Jonas took the document carefully, moving closer to the window's light to read it. His weathered face grew thoughtful as he studied the details. "Cold Spring Branch," he said slowly. "I know that water. It's about 5 miles south of here." He looked up at her. "That's the stream the mining company uses for their ore washing operations downstream." "What do you mean?" Maggie asked, not quite understanding the significance. Jonas laid the deed back on the table, his movements deliberate. "Water's more precious than gold out here, especially to miners. They need it to separate ore from rock. Without that stream, their operation would have to shut down or move." He tapped the paper. "If this deed's genuine, and it looks to be, you own the water rights to their main source." Maggie sank into a chair, her mind whirling. "So this land, it's valuable? Could be the most valuable 40 acres in the county." Jonas's voice was quiet but intense. "Question is, did your uncle know about this when he brought you out here?" A cold feeling settled in Maggie's stomach. He must have. Pa would have told his brother about any property he owned. She looked up at Jonas. "Do you think that's why he tried to—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Jonas nodded grimly. "Get you under his control at the miners' camp, then somehow take possession of the deed. Makes sense now." "What should I do?" Maggie twisted her hands in her apron. "First thing is keep this quiet until we can verify everything." Jonas carefully refolded the deed. "We don't want word getting back to your uncle or the mining company until we know exactly where we stand." Maggie nodded, seeing the wisdom in this. "But how can we check without alerting anyone?" "I've got a friend in the county seat who works at the land office." Jonas handed the deed back to her. "When the weather permits, I'll ride down there and have him look into it." Meanwhile, he glanced out the window. "Want to see your land?" Her face lit up. "Can we?" Storms passed, days clear. Good time to get the lay of the land. He smiled slightly. Proper owner should know what she's got. An hour later, they were mounted up, Jonas on his horse and Maggie on Button the mule, riding south along a trail that wound through snow-laden pines. The sun had risen high enough to start melting snow from the branches, sending occasional showers of powder down on them. Jonas led them up a long ridge, following game trails and old logging paths he seemed to know by heart. Near the top, he reined in. "There," he said, pointing down into the valley beyond. "See where that line of willows curves? That's Cold Spring Branch. Your 40 acres would start up near that stand of aspens where the spring comes out, following the stream down past those meadows." Maggie gazed at the scene below, trying to see past the snow to imagine it in other seasons. The stream valley looked wide and fairly flat, good for farming. The southern exposure would mean early planting. She could picture a cabin near the aspens, smoke rising from its chimney, maybe a barn, some chickens, a garden plot. "It's beautiful," she breathed, her cheeks pink with cold and excitement. "Good water, good soil." Jonas nodded approvingly. "Your pa chose well. That meadow there would support a few milk cows. Plenty of grass for hay, too. I could build a life here." Maggie's voice was soft with wonder. For the first time since leaving Missouri, she felt something like hope stirring in her chest. They sat their mounts in comfortable silence, watching the sun sparkle on the snow. A jay called from a nearby pine, and somewhere in the distance they heard the hollow knock of a woodpecker. "The mining camp's about 2 miles downstream," Jonas said finally. "Out of sight around that bend. They've got a big water wheel set up for their operation." He glanced at her. "Means you've got neighbors who might not be too happy once they learn who owns their water source." Maggie straightened her shoulders. "Then they'll have to learn to be neighborly, won't they?" A smile tugged at Jonas's mouth. "Reckon they will." They turned their mounts toward home as the sun began its westward slide. The temperature was dropping again, the day's brief warmth fading. But Maggie barely noticed the cold. Her mind was full of possibilities. A home of her own, land to work, a future she could shape with her own hands. As they rode, she snuck glances at the quiet man beside her. Jonas had already done so much, saved her from the auction, given her shelter, and now this. She wasn't sure how to thank him properly. "Jonas?" she said as they neared his cabin. "I'm grateful. For everything." He nodded, his eyes on the trail ahead. "Ain't right, what they tried to do to you. Man's got to stand up against such things." They rode the rest of the way in companionable silence. The last rays of sun painted the snow in shades of rose and gold, while long shadows reached out from the trees. Maggie touched the pocket where she'd tucked the deed for safekeeping. For the first time in weeks, maybe years, she felt truly warm inside, despite the settling cold of evening. Later, as she helped Jonas stable the animals for the night, Maggie found herself humming her father's favorite hymn. The familiar tune carried clearly in the still air, speaking of amazing grace and precious gifts undeserved but freely given. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cabin floor as Jonas spread out a map on the rough-hewn table. Maggie stood beside him, watching as his finger traced the route to town. "Trail's mostly clear now," he said, "but there'll still be ice in the shady spots. We'll need to take it slow." Maggie nodded, clutching the deed in her pocket. "How long to reach Redfern?" 3 hours, maybe 4 with the conditions. Jonas folded the map and tucked it into his coat. Best get started soon. Days are short this time of year. They bundled up against the cold, Jonas in his heavy buffalo coat, Maggie wrapped in layers of wool with a thick shawl around her shoulders. Outside, their breath formed clouds in the crisp morning air as they saddled the animals. Jonas helped Maggie mount Button, the sturdy mule shifting his weight in the crusty snow. "You sure about this?" he asked, adjusting her stirrup. "Once we file that deed, there's no going back. Everyone in the county will know." "I'm sure." Maggie's voice was firm, despite her nervousness. "Pa meant for me to have this land. I aim to claim what's rightfully mine." Jonas swung up onto his horse and they set out. The trail wound down through stands of pine and aspen, their hooves crunching in the snow. In places, the morning sun had started to melt the surface, making the footing treacherous. Jonas led them carefully, choosing the safest path. They rode mostly in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Maggie found herself remembering her father, his quiet strength, his belief in doing what was right no matter the cost. The deed in her pocket felt like his final gift to her, a chance at the independence he'd always wanted for his daughter. Near midday, they crested a rise and saw red fern spread out below them in the valley. Smoke rose from chimneys, and they could hear the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer. The mining company's ore-washing operation was visible at the edge of town, its big water wheel frozen in place for the winter. "Ready?" Jonas asked as they started down. Maggie straightened her back. "Ready?" They rode past the freight office where they'd first met just days ago. A few miners lounging outside fell silent as they passed, their eyes following Maggie. She kept her gaze forward, though her cheeks burned at the memory of the auction. The recorder's office was a small brick building next to the general store. Jonas helped Maggie dismount, then tied their animals to the hitching rail. Inside, a pot-bellied stove radiated welcome warmth. The clerk, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, looked up from his ledger. "Morning, Mr. Peterson," Jonas said, removing his hat. "Need to file a deed." The clerk adjusted his glasses. "Certainly, Mr. Hale, though I don't recall you owning any property hereabouts." "Not for me." Jonas gestured to Maggie. "Miss Garrison here has a deed needs recording." Maggie stepped forward, carefully unfolding the document. The clerk took it, spreading it flat on his desk. His eyebrows rose as he read. "Cold Spring Branch?" He looked up sharply. "This is the Thompson Mining Company's water source." "The deed predates their claim," Jonas said quietly, "by 3 years if I'm not mistaken." The clerk studied the paper carefully, holding it up to the light. He checked the seal, the signatures, the dates. Finally, he lowered it. "The deed appears genuine," he said slowly. "But I should warn you, Miss Garrison. Filing this will cause quite a stir. The mining company won't take kindly to learning someone else owns their water rights." Maggie lifted her chin. "I understand. But it's my land, fair and legal. I want it recorded proper." The clerk nodded, reaching for his official ledger. "As you wish, though don't say I didn't warn you." He dipped his pen and began copying the details in his precise handwriting. While they waited, Jonas moved to warm his hands by the stove. Maggie watched the clerk work, each scratch of his pen making her ownership more real, more official. When he finished, he sprinkled sand over the wet ink and carefully blew it away. "That's done," he said, making a final flourish. "The deed is now officially recorded. Here's your copy, Miss Garrison." He handed her back the original document. "God help you when Thompson finds out." They stepped back into the cold, the deed now safely tucked away in Maggie's pocket. Jonas was helping her mount when a familiar voice made her blood run cold. "Well, if it ain't the high and mighty miss who's too good for honest work." Her uncle stood across the street, his face red with drink even this early in the day. He spat in the snow, his eyes hard. "Uppity women," he muttered loud enough to carry. "Think they can own property like men. Ain't natural." Jonas's hand tightened on Button's bridle, but he didn't turn around. Maggie felt her stomach clench, remembering all the times her uncle's anger had turned to violence back on his farm. But she was no longer under his power. They walked their mounts past him without responding, though Maggie could feel his glare burning into her back. Only when they'd turned onto the main street did she let out the breath she'd been holding. "He can't hurt you now," Jonas said quietly. "You've got legal right to that land." "I know," but her voice shook slightly. "It's just, he's got friends in the mining camp. Mean ones." Jonas nodded grimly. "We'll keep watch. Meanwhile, let's get home before dark." The ride back seemed longer, shadows stretching across their path as the sun sank toward the mountains. The temperature dropped steadily, and Maggie was grateful for the warm layers Jonas had insisted she wear. By the time they reached the cabin, the first stars were appearing in the deep blue eastern sky. They took care of the animals first, making sure both horse and mule were properly rubbed down and fed. Inside the cabin, Jonas built up the fire, while Maggie put together a simple supper of beans, salt pork, and the last of yesterday's cornbread. They ate in comfortable silence, the fire crackling and popping in the stone hearth. After the dishes were cleaned, Jonas added more wood to the flames. The familiar domestic routine helped ease some of the tension from the day. Maggie sat in the chair by the fire, watching the dancing flames. Almost without realizing it, she began humming, an old hymn her mother used to sing while cooking or mending. The melody filled the small cabin sweet and clear. Jonas paused in his work, listening. Something in the tune seemed to touch him, softening the worry lines around his eyes. He didn't speak, just settled onto his bench and let the music wash over him. The fire cast flickering shadows on the log walls. Outside, a light snow had begun to fall, adding to the feeling of sanctuary within the cabin. For this moment at least, they were safe and warm, whatever storms might be gathering beyond these walls. Maggie's voice faded into silence, but the peace of the hymn lingered. She pulled out the deed one more time, running her fingers over her father's signature. The paper represented more than just land. It was hope, independence, a future of her own choosing. "Thank you," she said softly, glancing at Jonas, "for helping me do this today." He nodded, still gazing into the fire. It was the right thing. They sat together in the warmth, each lost in their own thoughts as the snow fell softly outside. The cabin had never felt quite so much like home, though they both knew this quiet evening was just the calm before a storm. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now they had this moment of peace. Jonas rose to bank the fire for the night, his movements practiced and sure. Maggie folded the deed carefully and tucked it away in her trunk. Whatever came next, she knew she wouldn't face it alone. 2 days passed in quiet routine at Jonas's cabin. The morning dawned crisp and clear, frost painting delicate patterns on the window panes. Jonas had left at first light to check his trap lines, leaving Maggie to tend to things at home. She'd decided to surprise him with fresh bread, knowing how much he enjoyed the smell of it baking. The cabin filled with the warm, yeasty scent as Maggie kneaded the dough on the rough wooden table. Her movements were sure and practiced, learned at her mother's side years ago. She hummed softly while working, feeling more at peace than she had in months. The deed to her land lay safely in her trunk, and despite her uncle's threats, no trouble had come their way yet. She had just shaped the loaf and set it to rise when something caught her eye through the window. Smoke, dark and thick, rose above the trees in the direction of Cold Spring Branch. Her land. Her heart jumped into her throat. That wasn't wood smoke from a chimney or campfire. That was the kind of smoke that meant destruction. Maggie rushed outside without even grabbing her coat, scanning the horizon. The column of black smoke twisted against the blue sky like an ugly snake. As she stood watching, hoofbeats thundered up the trail. Jonas appeared on his horse, riding hard, his face grim. "Get Button saddled," he called out as soon as he was within earshot. "There's trouble." Maggie was already moving toward the lean-to where Jonas's mule waited. Her fingers trembled as she worked the straps, but she forced them steady. Years of farm work had taught her to push through fear and get things done. They rode double on Jonas's horse, leaving Button behind. She was too slow for urgency. Jonas kept one arm around Maggie's waist as they galloped through the trees, following the familiar path toward Cold Spring Branch. The smoke grew thicker as they approached, stinging their eyes. When they broke through the tree line into the small clearing, Maggie's heart sank. The old trapper's cabin, the one she'd hoped to claim and make her own, was nothing but a pile of smoking timbers. Flames still licked at what remained of the roof, and the heat pushed them back several paces. "No," Maggie whispered. Just yesterday she'd been planning where she'd put her garden come spring. Now those dreams lay in ashes before her. Jonas dismounted first, helping her down. They approached the ruins carefully. The snow around the cabin had melted from the heat, leaving muddy patches that squelched under their boots. A crude wooden sign had been nailed to a post near what used to be the front door. The message was stark: "Sell or be sorry." Maggie reached out to touch the sign, then pulled her hand back. The wood was still warm. Jonas moved in a wide circle around the cabin's remains, his eyes scanning the surrounding forest. His hand rested on the revolver at his hip. "They're gone," he said finally. "Probably lit it and rode out fast, but they'll be watching to see how we react." Maggie nodded numbly. The scent of char filled her nose, making her eyes water. Or maybe those were tears. She wasn't sure anymore. The cabin had been old, barely more than a hunter's shack, but it had represented something precious: independence, a fresh start, a place of her own. "We should go," Jonas said softly. "Nothing more to be done here now." The ride home was silent. Even the birds seemed subdued, as if the violence had shocked them into quietness. The smoke followed them on the wind, a constant reminder of what had been lost. Back at Jonas's cabin, Maggie went through the motions of finishing her abandoned bread, though she knew it was over-risen now and would be heavy. She needed the familiar task to steady her hands, to give her mind something to focus on besides the image of her dreams going up in flames. Evening settled in early, as it did in the mountains. Jonas built up the fire while Maggie sat in her usual chair, staring into the flames. She couldn't help seeing echoes of the destruction in every flicker and spark. Jonas moved quietly around the cabin, doing small chores, filling the water bucket, sweeping the floor, laying out his gear for tomorrow. Finally, he poured coffee into 2 tin mugs. He set one beside Maggie without a word, then took his own seat on the bench. The coffee's warmth seeped into Maggie's cold hands but couldn't touch the chill in her heart. "Maybe," she said, breaking the long silence. "Maybe I should just give up. Sell the land to them." Her voice caught. "They'll only escalate from here. Everyone knows the mining company doesn't fight fair." "That's exactly what they want," Jonas said, his voice low but firm. "To frighten you into selling cheap, make you feel powerless." He took a sip of his coffee. "Question is, are you going to let them?" Maggie traced the rim of her mug with one finger. "I don't know how to fight people like that. They have money, connections. All I have is a piece of paper." "You have more than that," Jonas said. "You have right on your side. And you're not alone." She looked up at him then, seeing the steady determination in his eyes. The same quiet strength that had made him step forward at the auction, that had opened his home to her without hesitation. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, a coyote called lonely in the distance. Maggie took a deep breath of the coffee's rich aroma, letting it clear her head. The mining company had destroyed her cabin, but they hadn't touched the land itself. The stream still flowed, the soil still waited for spring planting. Maybe it wasn't about the building at all, but about what it represented, her refusal to be pushed aside, forgotten, erased. Her father's voice seemed to whisper in her memory, "Stand your ground, girl. God gave you a backbone for a reason." The coffee had cooled enough to drink. Maggie took a long swallow, feeling warmth spread through her chest. She wasn't that scared girl in the burlap sack anymore. She had choices now, and strength she was only beginning to recognize. Jonas watched her quietly, waiting. The firelight caught the silver threading through his dark hair, reminding her that he'd faced his own battles, his own losses. Yet here he sat, still willing to help fight someone else's fight. The destruction of the cabin had been meant to crush her spirit. Instead, she felt something hardening inside her, not into bitterness, but into resolve. The mining company had shown their hand. Now it was her turn to show them what she was made of. The evening deepened around them as they sat in companionable silence, each lost in thought. The bread, though heavy as Maggie had predicted, filled the cabin with its homey scent. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now they had this moment of peace in which to gather their strength. Through the window, stars began to appear in the darkening sky. The same stars that had guided her father west, that had watched over Jonas in his solitude, that now witnessed this quiet evening of decision. Whatever came next, Maggie knew this much was true. She would not be driven from her land by fear or fire. The coffee warmed her hands and Jonas's steady presence warmed her spirit. She wasn't alone anymore. Sometimes she was learning. That made all the difference. Dawn crept over the mountains, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold. Inside Jonas's cabin, Maggie moved quietly, gathering her meager belongings into a small bundle. Her hands shook slightly as she folded her spare dress and tucked away the few items she'd accumulated during her stay. The cabin was silent except for the soft crackle of the banked fire and Jonas's steady breathing from his bedroll near the hearth. Maggie paused, looking at his sleeping form. Gratitude and guilt warred in her heart. He'd already done more than anyone had a right to expect, stepping in at the auction, offering shelter, standing beside her when trouble came. But she couldn't let him risk more for her cause. She pulled on her coat and wrapped her shawl tight around her shoulders. The land deed was secure in her pocket. Maybe she could sell it quietly, somewhere far from here, start fresh where no one knew her name. Her hand was on the door latch when a deep voice broke the silence. Going somewhere? Maggie froze. Jonas sat up, fully dressed, his boots already on. He hadn't been sleeping after all. I can't stay, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. You saw what they did to that cabin. Next time it might be yours. Or worse. Jonas stood, his movements deliberate. And where exactly do you plan to go? The mining company has men watching every trail out of these mountains. I'll figure something out. Maggie lifted her chin, trying to sound more confident than she felt. I won't have your blood on my hands when they come looking for trouble. That's not your choice to make. Jonas crossed the room in 3 long strides, placing himself between her and the door. Besides, there's a better way to fight them. Maggie's hand dropped from the latch. Fight them? With what? They have guns, money, connections in Denver. And we have something stronger. Jonas's eyes held hers steady. We have truth, law, and neighbors who are sick of being pushed around. The miners have made enemies of every homesteader whose water they've fouled or diverted. Every rancher whose grazing land they've claimed for their operations. Witnesses? Maggie frowned, considering. You think others would speak against them? I know they would. Take the Hendersons over on Willow Creek. The mining company dammed their water source last spring, nearly killed their whole herd. Sarah Henderson would sign a statement in a heartbeat if it meant helping bring them down legal and proper. Maggie's resolve began to waver. The bundle in her arms suddenly felt heavier, like the weight of her decision. It would take time to gather evidence, statements. Time we have, Jonas said. Winter's setting in proper now. Even the mining company can't push too hard until the snow eases. He gestured to the cabin around them. You're safe here while we build our case. Through the window, Maggie could see fresh snow starting to fall. The idea of facing it alone, with nowhere to go, made her shiver. But more than that, Jonas's words had kindled a spark of hope she thought had died in yesterday's flames. All right, she said finally, lowering her bundle. Where do we start? Relief flickered across Jonas's face, quickly replaced by determination. We'll need to ride out today, talk to some folks. Weather's clear enough between storms. He moved to the fireplace, adding wood to build up the heat. Eat a good breakfast first, it's a long trail to the Henderson place. They shared a quick meal of cornbread and bacon, then prepared for the ride. Jonas insisted Maggie wear an extra layer of his wool socks inside her boots. She didn't argue. The memory of nearly freezing at the auction was still too fresh. The day was bright but bitter cold as they set out, riding double on Jonas's horse while leading Button the mule behind them. The snow-packed trail required careful navigation, their mount picking his way between drifts and ice-slicked rocks. Maggie found herself grateful for Jonas's solid presence behind her, his arm steady around her waist when the horse stumbled. Around midday, they crested a rise overlooking a small valley. A ranch spread out below them, smoke rising from the chimney of a well-maintained cabin. Beside it stood a barn and corral, where a handful of cattle huddled against the wind. Henderson Place, Jonas said, pointing to where a creek should have run through the valley. The stream bed was nearly dry, just a trickle remaining. Mining company built their dam up there. He gestured to the hills beyond. Diverted most of the water for their operation. They rode down to the ranch where Sarah Henderson met them at the door. She was a tall, angular woman with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen hard times. But her face softened when she recognized Jonas. Been wondering when you'd show up, she said, ushering them inside. "Heard about the trouble up at Cold Spring Branch." The cabin was warm and smelled of fresh bread. Sarah insisted they sit at her table while she poured coffee. As they warmed up, Jonas explained their situation and their plan to fight the mining company through legal channels. Sarah listened intently, her expression growing fiercer with each detail. When Jonas finished, she stood without a word and went to a desk in the corner. She returned with paper, pen, and ink. "I'll write out everything they did to our water," she said, already starting to write in a clear, firm hand. "The dates, the damage, how many cattle we lost. My husband's up in the high pasture, but he'll sign it too when he returns." She looked up at Maggie. "About time someone stood up to them proper." Maggie watched as Sarah's pen scratched across the paper, recording another piece of evidence against the mining company's bullying tactics. The woman's determination was infectious, strengthening Maggie's own resolve. They stayed through lunch, Sarah sharing stories of other neighbors who'd been wronged by the mining operation. By the time they left, they had not only her signed statement, but a list of other homesteaders to visit. The ride back to Jonas's cabin was quiet, both of them lost in thought. The short winter day was already fading toward dusk, the temperature dropping sharply. When they finally reached the cabin, their breath fogged in the cold air as they cared for the horse and mule. Inside, Jonas built up the fire while Maggie prepared a simple supper of beans and the last of Sarah's gifted bread. The familiar routine felt different now, charged with new purpose. As they ate, they planned their next moves, marking potential allies on Jonas's worn map of the area. "We'll need more than just water disputes," Jonas said, tracing the trail they'd need to take tomorrow. "Any witnesses who saw your uncle's dealings with the mining company would help too." Maggie nodded, thinking of the freight office workers who might have overheard conversations, the stable boys who saw comings and goings. "There might be some in town willing to talk, if they're assured of protection." "We'll find them," Jonas said with quiet confidence. "Truth has a way of coming to light, given time and courage." Looking at him across the table, Maggie felt something shift in her perception. He was no longer just the gruff mountain man who'd rescued her on impulse. She saw now the depth of his principles, the careful way he thought things through, the strength that came from choosing right over easy. The fire popped, sending up a shower of sparks. Outside, the wind had picked up, whistling through the pine boughs. But here in the cabin's warmth, Maggie felt more settled than she had since finding the deed. Running away would have been easier, perhaps safer in the short term, but standing to fight, not with violence but with law and justice, felt right in a way that touched her soul. She gathered their dishes, moving to wash them while Jonas marked a few more locations on his map. The quiet between them was comfortable now, built on shared purpose and growing trust. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more miles to ride, more stories to gather. But for tonight, they had this peaceful moment, planning their resistance in the firelit cabin while winter storms gathered in the mountains beyond. The morning sun cast long shadows across fresh snow as Jonas and Maggie set out from the cabin. Their saddlebags were packed with paper, ink, and provisions for several days of riding. The air held that peculiar winter stillness that made every hooffall seem loud against the packed snow. "First stop's the Thompson place," Jonas said, adjusting his scarf against the cold. "Jim Thompson lost 2 springs to the miners tunneling last year. Dried right up, just when his cattle needed water most. They found Jim Thompson mending fence posts, his weathered hands working methodically despite the cold. When Jonas explained their purpose, Thompson dropped his tools and led them straight to his house. His wife Martha served coffee while he wrote out his account in careful letters. "Them springs had watered this land since my daddy's time," Thompson said, sanding the ink dry. "Now look." He gestured out the window toward dead grass visible where snow had blown clear. "Can't grow nothing there no more." By midday, they'd collected 2 more statements from neighboring ranchers. Each told similar stories: water diverted, promises broken, threats made when they complained. Maggie kept the growing stack of papers carefully wrapped in oilskin, protected from the snow that started falling again as they rode on. Their next stop was the small church that served the scattered homesteads. Preacher Amos Whitefield welcomed them into his sparse quarters behind the sanctuary. His eyes lit up with interest as Jonas explained their mission. "Those mining fellows stopped attending services months ago," the preacher said, warming his hands around a tin cup. "Not just the tithes they promised, though that hurt our poor box something fierce. No. What troubled me more was how they drove away decent folks with their rough talk and rougher ways." He wrote out a detailed account of confronting the mine boss about both issues. "Got told to mind my own business if I knew what was good for me," he finished with a flourish of his pen. "Reckon standing up for right is every Christian's business, though." The school teacher, Miss Sarah Collins, proved equally eager to help. She described how mining runoff had fouled the creek where her students used to gather specimens for nature study. "Can't even let them wade there now," she said sadly. "The water turns their boots strange colors." Each signature added weight to their cause, but Jonas seemed preoccupied as they rode away from the school. When Maggie asked why, he explained their next destination. "There's folks who knew this land before any of us settlers," he said. "The Ute winter camp's not far. Elder Running Elk has been fighting the miners' damage to their fishing streams for months. His word could carry special weight, being First Peoples and all." Maggie felt her stomach tighten. Will they welcome us?" Jonas gave her a reassuring look. "Running Elk's known me since I first came to these mountains. I've always traded fair with his people, respected their ways. But stay close. Trust has to be earned." The Ute camp lay in a sheltered valley, protected from harsh winds by towering pines. Smoke rose from several lodges, and children played in the snow while women worked at winter tasks. Several men looked up as Jonas and Maggie rode in, their faces unreadable. A young man approached them, speaking first in Ute, then switching to English when he saw Maggie's confusion. "Jonas Hale. It has been many moons." "Good to see you, Thomas." Jonas dismounted, helping Maggie down. "We've come to speak with Elder Running Elk about the mining company's damage to the streams." Thomas nodded gravely. "The elder expected you might come. The waters grow worse each season." He gestured for them to follow. Elder Running Elk sat wrapped in blankets near a small fire, his face deeply lined but his eyes sharp. Thomas made introductions in Ute, then settled beside the elder to translate. Maggie found herself holding her breath as Jonas explained their purpose. The elder listened intently, occasionally asking questions through Thomas. His weathered hands moved expressively as he spoke of how the streams had run clear as crystal in his youth, full of fish and life. Now they ran brown with mining waste and the fish were scarce. "Our people have known these waters since before time was counted," Thomas translated as the elder spoke. "The streams are sacred, life-givers. To poison them is to poison the earth itself." Running Elk pointed to where children played nearby. "What will they drink when the last clean water is gone?" Through Thomas, they spent hours recording the elder's testimony. He spoke of specific places where the water had changed, of fish kills and sickened deer, of ancient agreements about sharing the resource that the miners had ignored. His words carried the weight of generations. As the winter sun began to set, Running Elk insisted they camp by the river that night, instead of riding back in darkness. "The water's voice speaks clearest at dawn," Thomas translated. "You should hear it to understand what you fight for." They made camp in a sheltered spot, where the river's music could still be heard beneath its coating of ice. After a meal of dried meat and corn cakes shared with Thomas and the elder, they sat around the fire while Running Elk told stories of the land. Through Thomas's translation, they learned how the waters had carved the valleys in the time of the ancestors, how they brought renewal each spring, how they connected all living things in an unbroken circle. Maggie found herself mesmerized by the elder's words and the way the firelight played across his face as he spoke. Thomas translated, "The miners see only what they can take. They do not understand that the water is like blood in the earth's veins. Stop its flow, poison its course, and everything dies." Maggie watched the starlight glinting off the icebound river. She thought of her father's deed, tucked safely away. It wasn't just a piece of paper granting ownership anymore. It was a responsibility to the water itself, to all the lives it touched, to a future beyond her own needs. "Tell him," she she said softly to Jonas. "Tell him I promise to protect it. Not just for me, but for everyone who depends on it." After Thomas translated her words, the elder studied her for a long moment. Then he smiled, reaching out to pat her hand. He spoke briefly, and Thomas translated. "He says you begin to understand. The water does not belong to any one person. We belong to it." They slept that night wrapped in borrowed blankets, the river's whisper in their dreams. At dawn, as promised, Running Elk led them to the water's edge. The first rays of sun struck crystal fire from the ice, while in places the dark water still moved, refusing to freeze. The elder spoke in his own language, his words a kind of prayer. Though Maggie couldn't understand the words, their meaning seemed to reach her heart. This was what she fought for, not just a deed, not just justice, but something older and deeper than paper laws could touch. When they prepared to leave, Running Elk pressed a small medicine pouch into her hands. "For strength," Thomas translated. "The path of right action is never easy, but the waters themselves will aid those who defend them." They rode away as the sun climbed higher, their saddlebags now holding not just settlers' testimonies, but the elder's careful account as well. Maggie touched the medicine pouch at her belt, feeling stronger somehow. The mining company might have money and influence, but she had something more powerful now, the truth of the land itself, spoken through many voices. "You're quiet," Jonas observed as they picked their way along the snowy trail. "Just thinking," Maggie said, "about what the elder said, how we belong to the water, not the other way around. Makes me see everything different somehow." Jonas nodded. "Running Elk has that effect on folks who listen with open hearts." He looked at her with quiet approval. "You listened well." Maggie smiled, remembering how nervous she'd been about the visit. Instead of fear or strangeness, she'd found wisdom and unexpected allies. The water truly did connect everyone, settler, native, rancher, preacher, in ways the mining company had forgotten or never understood. They rode on through the winter morning, the sun warm on their backs despite the cold air. Their saddlebags were full of testimony now, evidence of harm done and lives disrupted. But Maggie felt they carried something even more valuable, the strength of a community united in defense of something precious to all. The morning sun cast long shadows across Redfern's main street as Jonas and Maggie rode into town. Their saddlebags bulged with the signed testimonies, precious paper weapons against the mining company's power. The usual bustle of miners and merchants seemed subdued as they passed. Where folks had once called greetings to Jonas, now they turned away, hurrying into shops or ducking their heads. "Seems word's got around about what we're up to," Jonas muttered, his eyes scanning the street. Maggie sat straight in her saddle, though her heart hammered. "Let them look. We're doing nothing wrong." They tied their mounts outside the recorder's office. As Jonas helped Maggie down, heavy boots crunched in the packed snow behind them. They turned to find Mike Henderson, the mining company's foreman, blocking their path. Two other miners flanked him, their faces hard. Well, well," Henderson drawled, thumbs hooked in his belt. "If it ain't the mountain man and his fat little troublemaker." His gaze settled on their saddlebags. "Been mighty busy, ain't you? Riding all over, stirring up lies about honest business folk." Jonas stepped forward, placing himself between Henderson and Maggie. "Truth ain't lies, Mike, and honest folk don't burn down cabins or poison streams." The foreman's face darkened. "Accidents happen, Jonas, especially to folks who poke around where they don't belong." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Man could fall in a trap line. Woman could get lost in the mountains. Winter's mighty harsh up high." "That a threat?" Jonas's hand drifted toward his belt. "Just friendly advice." Henderson's smile never reached his eyes. "Companies got investments to protect. Be shame if protecting them got messy." Maggie touched Jonas's arm. "The clerk's waiting for us." Henderson and his men made no move to stop them, but Maggie felt their stares boring into her back as they climbed the recorder's office steps. Inside, the clerk, a thin man named Whitaker, looked up nervously from his desk. "Brought those testimonies about water rights violations," Jonas said, producing the carefully bundled papers. Need them filed with the territorial judge. Whitaker's hands shook slightly as he accepted the documents. Yes, well, quite a collection you've gathered. He shuffled through them, eyes widening at some of the names. The judge's clerk will want to see these right away, should be able to set a hearing date within the week. Make sure they stay safe, Maggie said firmly. There's folks who'd rather they disappeared. The clerk nodded, tucking the papers into a heavy leather portfolio. They'll go straight to the judge's office in my own hands. I may not look like much, Miss Garrison, but I take my duties serious. As they turned to leave, movement caught Maggie's eye through the office window. Her uncle stood in the saloon doorway across the street, watching. Their eyes met briefly before he lifted his glass in a mock toast. He's not going to let this go, she whispered. Jonas guided her out with a gentle hand on her back. Neither are we. They mounted up quickly, aware of hostile faces on all sides. The ride back to Jonas's cabin was tense, both of them watching the trees for movement. Every snapping twig made Maggie flinch. Even the familiar forest felt dangerous now. At the cabin, Jonas immediately set about securing things while Maggie prepared a simple supper. He checked the rifle, loading it fresh and setting it by the door. Extra shells went in his pocket. The windows were shuttered tight and he added a second bar across the door. Expecting trouble? Maggie asked, stirring the beans. Hope not, but Henderson ain't one for idle threats. Jonas tested the door's strength. Company's got hired guns, mean ones. They'll try to scare us off first, but if that don't work... He left the thought unfinished. Maggie ladled the beans into tin bowls, adding the last of their cornbread. My uncle will help them. He's always been more loyal to mining money than his own kin. They ate in silence, the cabin darker than usual with the shutters closed. Every sound from outside seemed magnified. The wind in the pines, small animals scurrying past, the crack of branches under snow's weight. Maggie jumped at a particularly loud snap. Can't live in fear, Jonas said quietly. That's what they want. I know. Maggie straightened her shoulders. But I keep thinking about that burned cabin, about Henderson's threats. She met Jonas's eyes across the table. Are we foolish, taking them on like this? Jonas was quiet a moment, considering. Maybe, but sometimes foolish is right. Your daddy left you that land legal and proper. The water rights that go with it are yours by law. If we don't stand against them now, they'll just keep taking whatever they want, hurting whoever gets in their way. Maggie nodded, remembering Running Elk's words about the sacred waters. Not just for us anymore, is it? For everyone who depends on that stream. That's right. Jonas stood to check the rifle again. Get some rest. I'll take first watch. I can help watch, Maggie protested, but Jonas shook his head. Need you fresh tomorrow. We've kicked up a hornet's nest. Got to be ready for whatever comes. Maggie settled onto her pallet, but sleep was long in coming. The cabin's familiar creaks seemed ominous now. Every shadow might hide a threat. Still, underneath her fear was a core of determination. They had done the right thing. The testimonies were filed. Soon there would be a hearing, and the truth would come out. She dozed finally, waking occasionally to see Jonas's silhouette by the window, rifle across his knees. Once she heard horses passing in the night, but they moved on without stopping. Toward dawn, Jonas finally lay down to rest while Maggie took her turn at watch. The sunrise painted the snow-covered mountains gold, but its beauty felt fragile now. Somewhere out there, men were plotting against them. But here in the cabin, they had each other's backs. Whatever came, they would face it together. Maggie checked the rifle's load again, just as Jonas had shown her. Her hands were steady. She was no longer the frightened woman in a sack being auctioned off. She had found her strength, her purpose, and, looking at Jonas's sleeping form, maybe something more. The morning light grew stronger. Another day of waiting began, with danger hovering just beyond the cabin walls. But they had made their stand. Now they had to be strong enough to see it through. The deep mountain cold settled over Jonas's cabin like a heavy blanket. Inside, the dying embers in the fireplace cast soft shadows on the walls. Jonas lay on his bedroll near the door, while Maggie slept on the bunk. both of them dressed against the chill. The crack of shattering glass pierced the midnight silence. Jonas bolted upright, grabbing the rifle in one fluid motion. "Maggie, stay down!" But Maggie was already moving, shrugging into her heavy coat. The sharp smell of coal oil cut through the crisp night air. Orange light flickered against the cabin's far wall, growing brighter by the second. "Fire!" Maggie's voice was tight with fear. Jonas yanked the door open, rifle ready. The winter air hit him like a slap. Along the cabin's outer wall, flames licked upward where a broken lantern lay scattered in pieces. The oil-soaked rag stuffed in its neck still burned, charring the logs black. "Get Snow," Jonas commanded, scanning the darkness between the trees. Nothing moved except shadows cast by the growing flames. Maggie scooped handfuls of snow from beside the door, tossing them at the fire's base while Jonas kept watch. The snow hissed and steamed, but slowly the flames died down. Together, they packed more snow against the scorched wall until only wisps of smoke remained. "That was close," Maggie breathed, her words forming clouds in the frigid air. Any closer to the window and it might have caught inside. Jonas knelt to examine the broken glass, careful not to touch it. Wasn't random. This was meant as a message. In the fresh snow, boot prints led away from the cabin, at least 2 sets heading toward town. The tracks were clear in the moonlight, made by men who hadn't bothered to hide their path. "They're getting bolder," Maggie said, wrapping her arms around herself. The night seemed darker now, the shadows deeper. "Because they're getting desperate." Jonas straightened, rifle still ready. "Hearing must be coming up soon. They're trying to scare us off before then." They stayed outside another hour, watching and listening, but no one returned. The cold eventually drove them back inside, though neither felt much like sleeping. Maggie built up the fire while Jonas reloaded the rifle and set it close at hand. "Try to rest," he told her. "I'll keep watch till dawn." Maggie nodded, but she lay awake long into the night, listening to Jonas's quiet movements as he checked the windows and door. Every creak of the cabin's timbers made her tense. When pale morning light finally crept through the shutters, Jonas saddled his mule. "Going to talk to the sheriff. This has gone far enough." "I'm coming with you," Maggie started, but Jonas shook his head. "Better if you stay here. Keep the rifle close. Anyone comes calling, you bolt the door and don't open it." Maggie wanted to argue, but she saw the sense in it. They couldn't both leave the cabin unguarded. "Be careful," she said instead. Jonas touched the brim of his hat and rode out, following the old boot prints toward town. The morning was crystal clear, sun glinting off the snow-covered peaks. But the beauty felt hollow now, tainted by the night's violence. In town, Jonas found Sheriff Brackett at his desk, drinking coffee and reviewing wanted posters. The lawman looked up as Jonas entered, his weathered face creasing with concern at Jonas's expression. "Trouble?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question. Jonas described the midnight attack, watching the sheriff's face grow grimmer. When he finished, Brackett sighed and set down his coffee cup. "Ain't got much to go on here, Jonas. Boot prints and snow won't hold up as evidence. Could have been drunks, could have been accidents." "You know better than that, Tom." Jonas's voice was quiet but firm. "First the cabin at Cold Spring gets burned. Now this. Mining companies sending messages plain as day." The sheriff stood and paced to his window, looking out at the street where miners were already gathering for their morning shift. "Maybe so, but proving it's another matter. These fellows protect their own. Nobody's going to testify against the company." "So you're saying there's nothing you can do?" Brackett turned back, his expression troubled. "I'm saying be careful, Jonas. Real careful. That hearing's coming up soon. Probably why they're pushing harder now. But until then," he spread his hands. "Best I can do is increase my patrols out your way. Maybe that'll make them think twice." Jonas nodded, though they both knew it wouldn't be enough. He left the sheriff's office and headed back home, taking a roundabout route to check if anyone followed. The sun was high by the time he reached the cabin. Delicious smells greeted him as he stepped inside. Maggie stood at the crude table, rolling out pie crust. 3 finished pies already cooled on the windowsill, their golden crusts perfectly crimped. "Been keeping busy," Jonas observed, hanging his coat. Had to do something with my hands, Maggie admitted. Mind races otherwise, thinking about what might happen next. She crimped the edge of another crust with quick, precise movements. What did the sheriff say? Jonas repeated Brackett's words while Maggie listened, her hands never stopping their work. When he finished, she nodded as if she'd expected no better. So we're on our own until the hearing, she said, sliding the last pie into the oven. Not entirely. Sheriff's increasing patrols, and we've got friends watching out for us. Running Elk's people, the homesteaders who signed statements. We're not alone. Maggie wiped flour from her hands and finally looked up at him. But our friends can't be here every minute, and the mining company knows that. True enough. Jonas checked the rifle's load out of habit. But we've come too far to back down now. That land's rightfully yours. The water rights that go with it could change things for a lot of folks around here. They spent the afternoon together, Maggie baking while Jonas repaired some winter gear. Neither strayed far from the rifle. As evening approached, they shared a simple supper of beans and fresh pie, both aware of the lengthening shadows outside. 3 more days till the hearing, Jonas said as they cleaned up. If we can just hold out that long, we will. Maggie's voice was stronger than she felt. Has to be worth something, doesn't it? Standing up for what's right? Jonas looked at her then, really looked at her. Gone was the frightened woman in a sack he'd bought at auction. In her place stood someone stronger, someone who'd found her courage despite every attempt to break her spirit. Worth everything, he said quietly. They secured the cabin for the night, checking windows and doors, banking the fire just right. The rifle stayed close at hand. Outside, snow began falling again, soft and steady, covering the boot prints that remained from the night before. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now they had each other's company, warm pie, and the knowledge that they were fighting for something bigger than themselves. It would have to be enough to see them through until the hearing. Dawn broke pale and cold over the mountains as Jonas and Maggie prepared for the hearing. They moved around the cabin in tense silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Maggie's hands trembled slightly as she pinned her hair, but her eyes in the small mirror showed determination. Jonas checked his pocket watch, 5 o'clock. Best get moving, he said, pulling on his heavy coat. Want to be there well before anyone else? Outside, their breath clouded in the frigid air as they saddled the horses. Light snow had fallen overnight, dusting everything in white. The mountains loomed dark against the lightening sky, their peaks obscured by low clouds that promised more snow. You ready? Jonas asked, helping Maggie mount. She nodded, clutching the reins tightly. The deed was safely tucked in her dress pocket, close to her heart. Ready as I'll ever be. They rode toward town at a steady pace, the horses' hooves crunching through fresh snow. Neither spoke much, but Jonas kept close to Maggie's side, watching the trail ahead and behind. The mining company had been quiet the past 2 days, too quiet in Jonas's experience. The sun was just clearing the eastern ridge when they reached Redfern. Snow flurries danced in the early morning light, settling on the wooden sidewalks and false-fronted buildings. A few early risers were already about, the baker stoking his ovens, the livery boy feeding horses. They nodded to Jonas and Maggie but didn't speak. The church stood at the end of Main Street, its white-painted walls and simple steeple stark against the gray sky. They tied their horses at the hitching post and climbed the steps. The door was already unlocked. Inside, oil lamps burned against the gloom. The territorial judge's clerk was arranging papers on a small table near the pulpit. He looked up as they entered. You're early, he said, nodding toward the front pews. Judge Maxwell will be here at 8 o'clock sharp. They settled into a pew, removing their coats. The church smelled of lamp oil and old hymnals, with lingering traces of Sunday's incense. Maggie's fingers kept straying to her pocket, touching the deed through her dress. Remember, Jonas said quietly, just tell the truth. That's all you need to do. Slowly, over the next 2 hours, the church filled. Miners filed in first, taking seats on the left side, rough men in work clothes, their faces set in hard lines. They muttered among themselves, casting dark looks across the aisle. On the right, Homesteaders and ranchers arrived in ones and twos. Many nodded to Jonas and Maggie as they passed. The rancher's wife, who'd first signed their statement, touched Maggie's shoulder briefly. "We're with you, dear," she whispered. Just before 8 o'clock, Running Elk and 3 other Ute men entered, causing a stir among the miners. They took seats behind Maggie, their presence both silent and powerful. The young interpreter who'd helped before sat with them. Last to arrive was Maggie's uncle, slipping in with the mining foreman just as Judge Maxwell entered through the side door. Everyone rose as the judge took his place behind the pulpit. Judge Maxwell was a tall man with iron-gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He surveyed the crowded church before speaking. "Be seated," he said, his voice carrying clearly. "We're here to address the matter of water rights on Cold Spring Branch, specifically regarding a deed claiming 40 acres along said water source." He shuffled through some papers. "I'll hear testimony from all parties, starting with the current deed holder. Miss Garrison?" Maggie stood, her knees shaking slightly. She made her way to the front, where a chair had been placed facing the judge. The deed felt like it was burning in her pocket. "Please state your full name for the record," the clerk said. "Margaret Ann Garrison. And how did you come to possess this deed?" Maggie's voice grew stronger as she spoke. "It was my father's land. He filed the claim before he died, but I didn't know about it until recently. The deed was sewn into the hem of my skirt. I found it by accident." "Objection!" Her uncle shot to his feet. "That paper's a forgery. She's lying about—" "Sit down, Mr. Garrison," Judge Maxwell said sharply. "You'll have your turn to speak." He nodded to Maggie. "Continue, Miss Garrison." Maggie drew the deed from her pocket and handed it to the clerk, who passed it to the judge. "The deed is properly signed and notarized, Your Honor. My father believed that land would be my inheritance, my chance at independence." "She's just a woman," someone called from the miners' side. "Can't own property without a husband." "Order," the judge commanded. "One more outburst and I'll clear this church." He examined the deed carefully. "This appears to be in order, Miss Garrison. But the mining company claims prior rights to the water. Why should your claim take precedence?" Maggie straightened in her chair. "Because that water belongs to everyone who depends on it, Your Honor. Not just for mining, but for farming, ranching, fishing." She gestured to the gathered witnesses. "We have testimony from folks who've had their water fouled or stolen by the mining operation. They've suffered while the company profits." Her uncle tried to interrupt again, but the judge silenced him with a look. For the next several hours, witness after witness came forward. The rancher's wife described how the diverted stream had dried up their cattle pond. A farmer told of crops withering when the miners cut off his irrigation ditch. Running Elk's interpreter conveyed how the sluice operations had muddied their traditional fishing grounds, making it harder to feed their people. The mining foreman presented his case next, arguing that their operation provided jobs and progress. He produced documents showing water rights purchased from other claims, though several witnesses questioned their validity. Through it all, Maggie sat with Jonas, listening intently. She noticed how the miners grew more restless as the testimony mounted against them. Her uncle kept whispering with the foreman, their faces dark with anger. Around midday, the judge called a brief recess. People filed outside to stretch their legs and eat the lunches they'd brought. Jonas and Maggie shared bread and cheese on the church steps, while Running Elk's people kept a careful watch nearby. "You did well up there," Jonas said quietly. Maggie managed a small smile. "Still more to come, though. Uncle Richard hasn't had his say yet." When the hearing resumed, her uncle took the stand. He painted a picture of Maggie as unstable, claiming she'd stolen papers from his office and run away from honest work. But under the judge's questioning, his story began to unravel. "And this contract you claim binds her to the mining camp," Judge Maxwell said, holding up a document. "Why does it lack her signature?" "She agreed verbally," her uncle blustered. "A man's word used to mean something in this territory." "A man's word, perhaps, but not his right to sell another person's freedom." The judge set the paper aside. "I find no legal basis for your claim on Miss Garrison's person or property." The afternoon wore on as more witnesses spoke. Snow continued to fall outside, visible through the church's windows. The lamps were lit again as daylight faded. Finally, Judge Maxwell raised his hand for silence. "I've heard enough for today. This is a complex matter requiring careful consideration. I'll announce my decision tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. He stood, gathering his papers. "This hearing is adjourned." People began filing out into the snowy evening. The miners left first, their boots clomping heavily on the wooden floor. Maggie's uncle paused in the aisle beside her. "You're making a mistake, girl," he said in a low voice. "Some things are bigger than your silly dreams of independence." "The only mistake was trusting you," Maggie replied evenly. "I'm not afraid of you anymore, Uncle Richard." He stalked out, leaving a cold draft in his wake. Jonas helped Maggie with her coat and they stepped outside. The street was already empty, though lamplight glowed in the saloon windows. Running Elk and his men mounted their horses, nodding solemnly to Jonas and Maggie before riding out. "Stay at my place tonight," the rancher's wife offered, coming up beside them. "Safer than riding back to that isolated cabin in the dark." Jonas looked at Maggie, who nodded gratefully. They collected their horses and followed the rancher's wagon out of town. The snow was falling harder now, erasing the day's tracks and muffling all sound except the creak of wagon wheels. At the ranch, they were given a hot supper in separate rooms in the main house. Maggie lay awake for a long time, watching snow pile up on the windowsill, wondering what tomorrow's verdict would bring. Down the hall, she could hear Jonas's steady footsteps as he kept watch, neither of them quite ready to believe the danger had passed. Preacher Whitefield's parsonage was small but warm, with quilts on every bed and a pot of soup always simmering on the stove. After the long day of testimony, the simple comfort felt like heaven to Maggie. Through the night, she could hear the wind howling outside, bringing more snow down from the mountains. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," the preacher said over breakfast, passing her a plate of biscuits. "Sometimes he uses a storm to keep folks right where they need to be." Jonas nodded from his place by the window, where he'd been watching the snow pile up against the fence posts. The street outside was invisible under white drifts that reached halfway up the church steps. By 9 o'clock, people were already pushing through the storm into the church. Ranchers stamped snow from their boots in the vestibule. Miners filed in, their faces hard as stone. Running Elk and his men arrived just before the judge, their dark blankets dusted with white. Maggie sat between Jonas and the preacher, her hands clasped tight in her lap. The deed lay safe in her pocket, but her future hung on what would happen next. Judge Maxwell entered, his black robe swishing as he took his place. The packed church fell silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. "I have reviewed all testimony and evidence in this matter," the judge began, his voice filling every corner of the building. "The deed presented by Miss Margaret Garrison is legitimate, properly filed, and takes precedence over later claims. Her 40 acres along Cold Spring Branch, including water rights, are hereby confirmed as her lawful property." A murmur ran through the crowd. Maggie's heart leaped. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "the mining syndicate is ordered to cease all use of water from Cold Spring Branch without the express permission of the property owner. Damages in the amount of $100 are to be paid to Miss Garrison for destruction of improvements on her land." The mining foreman's face turned purple. Maggie's uncle slumped in his seat, all his bluster gone. "This court also finds no validity to the alleged labor contract between Richard Garrison and his niece." The judge's stern gaze found her uncle. "Any attempt to enforce such claims will result in criminal charges. This ruling is final and binding." He struck his gavel once, the sound sharp as a gunshot. For a moment, no one moved. Then the miners began filing out, their boots heavy on the floorboards. Maggie's uncle slipped away without looking at anyone. But as they left, others pressed forward, ranchers, farmers, Running Elk's people, all offering congratulations and warm handshakes. "You done good, girl," the rancher's wife said, hugging her tight. "Your pa would be proud." Through it all, Jonas stood quietly nearby, a slight smile beneath his beard. When their eyes met, he touched the brim of his hat, and that simple gesture meant more than all the other congratulations combined. The storm had eased by the time they mounted up for the ride home. Fresh snow lay like a clean white blanket over everything, softening the hard edges of the world. Their horses broke trail through the drifts, following the familiar path back to Jonas's cabin. That evening they sat by the fire, mugs of coffee warming their hands. The victory felt both huge and simple, like the difference between being lost and finding your way home. "I've been thinking," Maggie said slowly, "about rebuilding at Cold Spring Branch. A proper cabin this time, with a garden plot and maybe some chickens to start." Jonas nodded, poking at the fire. "Good spot for it. That south-facing slope would make fine pasture, too." "It'll be a lot of work." "Reckons so." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "But you won't have to do it alone." The winter days flowed like the stream itself, steady and purposeful. With the settlement money in hand, Jonas and Maggie set to work building their new home on Cold Spring Branch. The cabin rose log by log, each timber carefully chosen and placed. Jonas's skilled hands guided the work, while Maggie's practical mind planned the layout. A proper kitchen, space for storing preserves, windows positioned to catch the morning light. Neighbors appeared with offerings, their wagons loaded with gifts. The rancher's wife brought a box of laying hens, already clucking and ready for a coop. The school teacher arrived with flower seeds saved from her own garden. Even the preacher contributed, hauling precious window glass all the way from Denver. One crisp morning, Elder Running Elk came to the stream. He stood in silence, watching the clear water tumble over rocks, then spoke soft words in his own tongue. Through his young interpreter, he explained it was a blessing, not just for the water, but for all who would share in its gifts. On their first Sunday in the finished cabin, sunrise painted the snow-covered meadow in rose and gold. Jonas rose early to start the coffee, while Maggie shaped bread dough with practiced hands. The smell of baking filled every corner, mingling with wood smoke from the River Rock fireplace. They sat together in the warmth, watching snow drift past the windows. Jonas reached over and took Maggie's hand, his voice gruff with emotion. "Best $2 I ever spent." Maggie squeezed his fingers, her eyes bright. "You didn't buy me. You paid the ransom." Their joined hands rested between them, strong and sure. Through the window, the land stretched white and endless, full of possibility. Neither of them felt the old loneliness anymore. They had found their home and each other. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.